So I wanted information to get out. I wanted ideas to be free. I wanted to dress them up and present them in a way that was going to be provocative and interesting and useful and that kind of thing. And so that was why I was doing what I was doing. But now that these things have come into question, now that the rule of law is in question or overtly under assault in different parts of the world, there is a question like, what is the rule of law? Why is it important? Why do we do this and not simply go for some other kind of system? That particular instrument, Tyler, unlike the other ones that we have traditionally created in law schools, is not aimed inside. It is not aimed at other law schools, other law professors. It's aimed at the world every day.
All right, welcome everyone to the inaugural episode of the Beyond Today podcast. Today, we are joined by an extremely special guest, befitting of an inaugural episode, Professor Bernard Hibbitts. He's a very well-renowned academic, an entrepreneur, and an innovator in the legal space, and is a graduate of law at institutions like Oxford, of Dalhousie, of University of Toronto, and the Harvard Law School, and many more academic qualifications as well. So he later then founded the service Law Professors on the Web in 1996, and with the name JURIST finally being officially adopted in 1997, and is the organization that he is the founder of and also the editor-in-chief of right now. And between 1996 and 1998, he also posted a lot of his articles and conference presentations on his now archived, I believe, personal website, and is actually one of the first, I believe, created by a law professor. So, he was the first law professor to publicly post a full-length law review article online. Safe to say, he's always been leading kind of the or spearheading innovation in like the legal academic or like the academic aspect of like law. So he's now a law professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and is proudly operating his project JURIST. And he's also been has been deeply instrumental and impactful in the beginning of my law school journey as someone who is currently working at JURIST. So, I mean, that is kind of like the introduction. I mean, you are very qualified, and I'd love you to kind of highlight some of your own experiences that you think, are important to you as well.
So thank you, Tyler, for that introduction, and thank you also, Vidit, for hosting me on this inaugural podcast. I appreciate the opportunity very much. It has been, as you have implied, Tyler, a long and winding road in so many ways, and some of the things, in fact, a good number of the things that I have done over the years have been somewhat unanticipated. Certainly, JURIST was not something that I anticipated doing at any juncture. Certainly when I arrived here at the University of Pittsburgh, straight from Harvard in 1988, that was not in my mind at all. And then when the project was first started, it was really something very different. It was, as you said, law professors on the web. It was a gathering place for law professors who were just starting to put their own materials online, their course pages, perhaps abstracts of their publications, things like that, making those things available to the public for the first time. But I decided in that context that I wanted to develop the idea and the project more because I'd always been interested in communication. I'm a legal historian by training, actually. That's my scholarly background. And because I had studied the impact of writing and print and electronic media in previous years, when the internet came along, I thought, hey, this is an opportunity to actually get involved in its development and not just sit back and study it. So I thought the best thing to do was to get online and to try things out and to see where things went. And things went in just a wild and crazy direction over the next 25 years, with the result that you and I are now working together on this, Tyler. And we are, of course, working with more than 100 law students from 25 countries around the world in what is really the only real-time collaboration of law students globally. That was certainly never imagined. So things have a way of working. I think it was a good time back in the late 1990s to do what I did. And along the way, we've been able to take advantage of technology and serendipities to create something which is really unique. And I hope I'll have a chance to talk about that more in this particular podcast.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, jurist is something that is close to both of us, and I'm very glad that you brought it up as well, because this kind of can go into like the first thing that I really wanted to talk to you about, which is just the role of initiatives like jurist in democratizing legal information and how they've influenced, justice or access to justice as a whole. So obviously, throughout your career, you've identified gaps in whatever legal market there was, right? The fact that we didn't have accessible information online with these new technologies that were emerging, and you decided to capitalize on that. When you initially started Juris, and as Juris has kind of evolved now, do you think its purpose has kind of evolved over the years since your initial kind of conception of what Jurist was going to be? Do you think your mission has changed at all? How do you think like Jurist, like how Jurist has kind of like changed its mission throughout these years?
It has morphed, Tyler. There's no
Mm,
question that it has morphed. When it started out as law professors on the web, it was designed even at that point to be a platform that we could use to reach out to the public. I mean, I was conscious of the fact that we were not really, as academics, as individuals within the law school space, we were not really connecting with people outside our buildings very well. There weren't a lot of services, exercises, projects undertaken in any law school, really, in the country that did that kind of thing. Law students would meet the outside world perhaps in clinics, but those were limited in scope. And yet there was, I thought, an audience for legal information. I thought that that audience wanted to know ultimately not just how to do things, write a will or execute a contract or whatever, but I thought that audience actually would want to know what was happening in law, because law is dynamic. Law affects all of us. Law is obviously something that is continually in the news, as we've discovered since. Obviously that was a lack. And although mainstream media carried legal stories from time to time, those stories weren't particularly prominent very often. There were, of course, occasions when they were. But as we continued with Jurist, and as I developed the sort of first generation model of this, it became apparent that there was public demand for academics to come out and inform people about what was going on in the law. We were doing this initially, Tyler, at the time of the Clinton impeachment crisis, which is sort of at the end of the 1990s. And people wanted to see documents, and they wanted to know what the process was. They wanted to know about impeachment. They wanted to know all this stuff. And they wanted to get that information from an authoritative source. They were wary, even at that stage, they were wary of partisanship. They were wary of commercial sources that would simply offer them information, but would require payment of some sort, or would require them to pay attention to advertising and things like that. They just wanted to know, and they wanted to know from people who knew about the constitutional background and the legislative background and the historical background. And so we started to get questions from people about things that were going on.
mm,
And I thought, well, this is interesting. Maybe we can be more real time in all this. Maybe we can actually start to deliver things that aren't prepackaged in terms of our own courses and our own research, but things which respond to what the public wants to know and needs to know from our perspective in real time. And so when that started to happen, we started to move and change, and we started to put together lists of resources, materials, links, of course, at the time was a big thing, that would lead people to other information, which we, of course, had vetted and we thought were reliable. And those collections of links began to take off. And then we started to engage individual scholars to write something about these issues as they were developing. And then we started to even go beyond that and develop sort of larger scale resources that could be deployed for the benefit of the public. And then we got students involved. And that was a really big deal and transformative. But the point is that we responded to the times, and because we were digitally native, because Jurist had no precedent, there was no equivalent in print, we could move, we could change, we could morph effectively and quickly. And that's what we did. And we've been doing that now for 28 years or whatever it's been. And we continue to grow because we are freed from the fetters of a print model. But it certainly has morphed over time, and I think that's been the secret of our success in many respects.
And Professor, just to follow up a little bit, I mean, one of the things that I really wanted to ask about with regards to that is that, law is often viewed as sort of a very traditional industry. And, with jurists, there's the ability to reach out to individuals that want to learn more about the legal system, but might not have any experience with it. But was there a sufficient amount of pushback that you got when you founded Jurist from within the legal community in terms of adopting this sort of digital? And I know I might have sort of hit on a very, very important topic that might have come up, but I'd love to learn more about that.
It's interesting, Vidit, because there wasn't so much pushback as a certain obliviousness. In other words, they weren't interested.
Right.
And they weren't interested because this sort of thing, Vidit, was not, and still is not, but was not something that law schools did, right? We were not seen, and we're still not seen as bridges to the world. We're still not seen that way. We are seen as incubators of professions. And that's what we do. And that's why all our focus is directed inward, within our walls at educating the law students that we are in charge of. Or our focus is directed at other law schools, other academics. I mean, we sort of have this conversation back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. But we don't turn around and focus outside the walls. We just don't do that. And so when I did that, I mean, I thought, yeah, this is important to do. It's kind of critical. And yeah, we weren't the absolute only people doing something like that. At the time, there were other enterprises that were reaching out in that direction. But again, it just wasn't done. So there was no pushback. When you did talk to people, the reaction was, "Oh, that's nice," and I still to this day remember this wonderful conversation that I had with the dean of a Canadian law school, who shall remain nameless, a dear friend of mine, actually. And we were talking at one point, and we were talking over lunch when I was up in Halifax. And he said to me at one point, Bernie, law schools don't do news. And that just struck me because I thought, why not? Why shouldn't we do that? Why shouldn't we take a public role? Why shouldn't we take responsibility? Why shouldn't we train students and use the news and current events as a vehicle? It's no more ridiculous than using 14th century cases. So why not do these things that would actually reconnect us to the public, which we've sort of abandoned? And here I'm speaking not just as a legal educator, but also as a legal professional. I mean, we have sort of pulled away from the public in so many ways, right? We hide in our law schools. We hide in our office towers. We hide. And we're not connected. This is a way to get back in touch with people and to do something with them and to do something which is frankly about them in some ways, and to do something positive. And so while the response to what I was doing was underwhelming in some ways, that in itself told me that we were doing the right thing, because we needed to do something which was so insignificant to people that they didn't even see that it needed to be done. And I think it still needs to be done. I think we're just starting to address this need. Hopefully we will continue to do that. And hopefully in the long run, it will make a contribution.
And I mean, Professor, the other thing I wanted to sort of ask about that is, I know around the time when Jurist was founded, you did sort of have, thoughts and suggestions for how law reviews and publications from within law schools could reform to sort of meet this greater public purpose, to be able to sort of make connections more with the broader community outside of just the legal community. And I think one of the curiosities that both myself and Tyler have is, do you think that, law reviews have actually met this challenge and have sort of adapted as a result of the criticisms and the feedback that innovators such as yourself had brought up?
I think law reviews have made changes, and I think that's fine. But I don't think they've made anything like the changes that I was recommending even in the late 1990s. I mean, if you look at the archived online versions, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn here, I'm just sort of calling it as it is. If you look at the archived online versions of what I was doing in terms of trying to create a new type of scholarship, which used multimedia and links and had feedback from readers and all this kind of stuff, I was doing that with individual essays online that I'd published for the web, for that platform back in the late 1990s, 1996, 1997. We still don't do that by and large in most law reviews today, and we are now more than 25 years down the line from that. I think I overestimated the pace of likely change. I think I thought that people would simply go faster in what seemed to be, what seemed to me to be an appropriate direction. I think I also underestimated the value of prestige for my academic colleagues, because for me, the game was always to reach people and to get to people, and not to publish in journal X for the purposes of getting tenure at institution Y. I mean, that was not what I was about. So I wanted information to get out. I wanted ideas to be free. I wanted to dress them up and present them in a way that was going to be provocative and interesting and useful and that kind of thing. And so that was why I was doing what I was doing. But I don't think that's a lot of what we're doing. I think that, law students can get benefits from law reviews. That's fine. Law students can get benefits from things that aren't law reviews, as Tyler hopefully will admit. But at the same time, I was just trying to do something different, and we've been slow in all this. But the two exercises, Vidit, go together, because it was that initial work on law reviews and the excitement of putting my own work online and getting to paint the canvas in a whole new way and having the freedom to do that. The complete freedom to do that caused me to think, gosh, if I can reconceptualize what legal scholarship could look like and our relationship with our readers could look like, then maybe we can reconceptualize together what the entire relationship is between law schools and a public that really needs information in order for society to improve and reform. And so one thing kind of led to another, and that's where we are now. But yes, you're right, Vidit. It does go back to the initial work I did with law reviews way back then. But like I said, we haven't even got to that point yet, right? Really.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, so firstly, due to the fact that I'm trying to get an associate editor position on my law review, I will say publicly that I believe that the law review is the greatest gift to mankind, and it has done nothing wrong.
and I should say in my own defense, here, Tyler, that I was a card-carrying member of the Harvard International Law Journal when I was doing my graduate work, and so I've been there and done that, and that's fine. But and I will leave the rest to you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, look, I think regardless, I think the takeaway from what you just said was so interesting in the sense that the most important areas of innovation aren't really that obvious to us, right? Sure, in some cases where change needs to be made, where maybe oppression exists, or maybe some very conservative way of thinking exists, you'll face vehement opposition because the systems that be just don't accept it, and those types of changes obviously need to be made. And, all of our focus is surrounding those because they're sensational, they're big, they're large changes and require some level of upheaval. But, from what you said, I think it's so clear that the vast majority of innovations that need to be made are ones where people just kind of look at and, as you say, go, okay, that's nice, I guess, whatever, right? It's you started a legal publication online, sure, whatever. It's not, nothing's going to really happen because of it. And if many cases, I think that these innovations are even harder to spot because there's no obvious kind of lack of some kind of need that isn't being addressed. These are just things that we accept to be the case, and then we just recognize this as the status quo and just don't really touch it. So I think that that's really interesting, and this goes into my next question then, which is that with jurists there is a huge focus on the idea of rule of law as central to the ways in which you do your publications and center your story writing and stuff like that. Is there a reason why Jurist has made its mission central around this? Is there something that maybe I'm not seeing, or Vidit might not be seeing when it comes to understanding how we should understand legal news stories?
It's an interesting question, Tyler. And again, it goes back to how Jurist has morphed over the years, right? We are always trying to address what we consider to be a need. And I think we've made important steps, and we've made progress in a variety of ways, but definitions of need change over time. I think at the beginning, and I think still to a large extent, there is a need for broad, vetted carefully presented information on legal trends and developments and events and issues in the world. That exists now just as it existed in the late 90s, early 2000s. But as you may have noticed, we live in a different situation now than we did 20, 25, 30 years ago. The world is more fractured. The world is polarized. The world is riven by multiple wars. At this particular point, domestic politics, both in the United States and Canada and elsewhere in Europe, is much more complicated in many respects than it was. The rule of law, the position of law itself, is much more problematic than it was. There is less that is taken for granted here. And so as we have watched this, because we have not only watched this, we have documented this, over the years on Jurist, we have written the stories that explain this, that show this trend in a variety of ways. We got to the point, Tyler, a couple of years ago, of thinking that instead of just posturing what we did as the delivery of legal news, and again, we do this, we needed to be a bit more pointed because the times had changed. And so we thought that to give it a bit more of a twist and an edge and to emphasize the relevance of the exercise, we needed to talk more overtly about what you just referred to. That is to say, rule of law, right? The state of law around the world, the challenges that exist to the authority of law, the fairness of law, the equity of law, all of these things which are bound up in this very multidimensional concept. That I won't get into here, but the point is that as law itself came into question, we had to do more than just say, okay, we're presenting legal news. We had to sort of position ourselves in a way which communicated our dedication to what law is all about, sort of the enhancement and preservation of justice in the world. And so in that particular context, we changed focus slightly, but we only changed it slightly, Tyler, and we looked into this actually before we made any changes. We looked at our own pattern of coverage. And the issues that we identified preliminarily as related to rule of law, which you could look at in a wide way or a narrow way or whatever, already made up, as we were doing this analysis, about 70 to 80% of what we were covering. And so we weren't really changing what we were doing. We were just repackaging what we were doing. We were representing what we were doing. We were a little bit like there's a character in one of Moliere's plays. I think it's something called the Bourgeois Gentilhomme or something like this. And the character at one point is surprised by something when he learns that he's been speaking prose all the time. And so we've actually been doing this all the time. We've been talking about the rule of law all these years. All we're doing now is making it explicit. But because of that, we are putting ourselves in dialogue with a lot of the other discussions that are going on in law right now about the rule of law, about democracy, about the future of peaceful societies around the world. And so this was just another way of making it obvious, hopefully more obvious to our readers, our potential readers, that what we were doing was significant, important, and timely. And so I think that was sort of part of the reason we did this. It wasn't a profound readjustment of our mission. It was just a specification that helped us and perhaps would help others understand the significance of what we were trying to do. And then, of course, you have the angle of law students actually being engaged in reporting the rule of law in crisis, which is what we do. And that makes sense. And that's important because law students represent the future. And if law students are not doing this, if law students are not involved in this, if law students aren't monitoring this, then what happens? Where do we go? What do we do? I mean, that's necessary.
I mean, Professor, just to sort of ask another question related to that, as rule of law becomes a more important discussion for us in society, I know you mentioned that one of the main aims of Jurist was to sort of, have some sort of a response to the curiosity about law that exists amongst society as a large. Have you found that, because of the fact that rule of law has become more prominent of a discussion topic in our society over maybe the last decade or so, that this curiosity that even non-trained individuals in law have, do you think this curiosity has gotten deeper and as a result has sort of encouraged more people to seek out sources of information related to the law in comparison to the past?
I think that's the case, Vidit, but it's hard for me to measure that. Obviously, I mean, jurist audience, broadly speaking, goes up, and that's great, but that's a pretty blunt measure. I think certainly that term is on people's lips more now than it was. If we go back 15, 20 years, I mean, you guys, can do a Google Ngram search and you can check it out. But, I think that people are talking about this much more. But here's an interesting point. When we started to talk about this internally on Jurist, when we started in particular to talk about this with our law student staff, because of course Jurist is an amalgam of professional staff and law student staff. One of the questions was, coming from the law students, what is the rule of law? And that wasn't a specious question, because we don't actually historically talk very much about the rule of law in legal education. Tyler, you're just starting out in law school. Vidit, you've got a bit more experience. But in most law schools, at least in the United States, and I presume also still in Canada, there is not that much of an explicit discussion about this because we take the basic values for granted. And we also assume that if people are coming to law school, they believe in this in some way, shape, or form. They accept the values that we would commonly identify with the rule of law. And so why talk about this? But now that these things have come into question, now that the rule of law is in question or overtly under assault in different parts of the world, there is a question like, what is the rule of law? Why is it important? Why do we do this and not simply go for some other kind of system, which is more arbitrary or more authoritarian or whatever it is that we want to say? So we need to become explicit about this, and we need to examine the rule of law itself as a concept. We need to unpack it, and we need to relate what we are doing on a day-to-day basis, or what happens in the law, to whether or not those things support the rule of law, challenge it, undermine it, or do whatever. Because suddenly this has all come into question. So I'm hoping that with Jurist being more overt in its own coverage of the rule of law, we are encouraging our students, we are encouraging our readers to think about what that rule of law is, what that rule of law means, and to think about various ways in which you can describe and imagine it, because there are sort of what they call thin definitions of the rule of law, very procedural, very technical, lawyerly types of definitions. And then there are what you might call thick definitions of the rule of law, which are larger and more elaborate and more socially ambitious, and which really, I think, could blow the concept up in a good way, make it more dynamic and effective for people. But at least we want to be involved in this discussion, in this conversation, and we want to identify the rule of law as being really at the heart of what law students and lawyers need to not only believe in, but talk about and uphold in order for them to be doing their professional duty.
No, absolutely. I mean, like that is like spot on in the sense that, I mean, Vidit and I are students of political science, and yourself, professor, being a scholar in politics, especially with how integral it is, to being a legal historian as well. And you make a fantastic observation, which is that the rule of law in many cases is being challenged internationally. And in that process at Jurist, you have hundreds of law students across so many different countries applying, like you said, different philosophies of law, sometimes even completely different systems of law as well that might not, like you say, take the rule of law as a value for granted. And, in this process, I'm sure that our understanding of concepts like the rule of law, similar to any kind of political concept like that of liberalism, for example, adapts and evolves and changes over time. So I guess like two-parter question is like, do you think that, with the rise of jurists, or with the rise of, so many different international legal systems engaging with each other, do you think that the rule of law has evolved in its conception, and what has that evolved from? And the second is, where do you see our future understandings of the rule of law being? Because I'm going to assume that it's going to be a little bit different than what our traditional understanding of what the rule of law actually is. I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think it does, Tyler. I mean, certainly we've talked about the rule of law, or we've talked about concepts and ideas which can be related to the rule of law for a very long time, right? I mean, you can trace its intellectual beginnings back, a couple of thousand years, in some way, shape, or form, right? And what the rule of law means at any particular time period may be a reflection of the needs and circumstances of that time. I think there are core values. As I said, I think there are more peripheral values. And to some extent, maybe the debate is mostly about the peripheral values. For instance, what's the relationship between the rule of law and democracy? Is democracy fundamental to the rule of law? Maybe not. You probably can have a rule of law without a democratic system in a technical sense, but you still have to respect other things which are important. And that, of course, brings us, Tyler, to the question of how the rule of law is seen in different social and political systems, right, around the world. And on JURIST, certainly, again, we are connected with students from a wide range of systems. So, when you're thinking about the rule of law in Canada, is it the same as someone's thinking about the rule of law in Europe? Is it the same as someone's thinking about the rule of law in mainland China, where we have staffers at the moment? The answer, probably not. So perspectives are going to differ, and also the practical meaning of that will change, right? Because the consequences of having rule of law in each of those areas will be different depending on the needs and circumstances of those countries, of those societies. We need to be able to have a dialogue about this. I'm not sure that there's a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. We don't need to necessarily go in the direction of having the rule of law with Chinese characteristics or Canadian characteristics or European characteristics or whatever it is you want. But there is some truth in that, because again, it is a big beast, and you are a little bit like the blind man and the elephant in approaching that beast. But yet there's a consensus, and that's one of the things that I see on JURIST, because when we've got so many students, law students from around the world, all working on a project which engages them in reporting the rule of law in crisis, yes, their specific definitions may differ. Again, the law student in Kenya may have a different view of this than the law student in Australia, but yet there is a broad enough agreement on what is really meant by the idea or the ideal to allow them to work together and to reinforce each other and to produce a message which, at the end of the day, I think is constructive and ambitious, and which allows them to feel that they themselves are sharing in ideas and ideals which are held by many other of their counterparts around the world. Because that's the neat thing about JURIST. Even though the students are so disparate, Tyler, even though they come from so many different places, they have so much in common. And I think this dedication to the rule of law, as they see it, but there is a common core of sorts, but this dedication to the rule of law is primary, and they want to invoke this, and they don't want to just use it as an excuse to not change things. They actually want to use it as an excuse to change things, because that's important to everybody in this service in a fundamental way. Because of course, when you're providing information, you're providing potentially a ground for change, right? You're giving people tools they can use, that you provide them with insights that they can use to see that situations perhaps aren't good, can be improved, can be changed, that kind of thing. So the law students that we're engaging with around the world are trying very hard, I think, to come together and use the rule of law and use JURIST as a lever to accomplish positive change in their circumstances and societies.
Professor, seeing how much of a wide reach that JURIST has, and the fact that law students are able to get, perceptions and perspectives from students all over the world, I think that myself and Tyler are very privileged to go to law school in an era where we have programs such as JURIST, but also other conferences and competitions that consistently let us speak to law students from around the world and hear a little bit more about the way legal systems work, in other places. One of the questions that I have is that, given how important sort of this global dialogue is in terms of democratizing legal information, what was it like prior to services like JURIST and programs like JURIST in terms of your ability to actually meaningfully access information about different legal systems? Was legal education sort of very much focused on just a very sort of specific geographical location in which you're studying?
That's a good question, Vijay, and I haven't really thought about it that much, because of course I've just assumed the change, as we've gone forward here. Did I feel particularly isolated before in my study of law in other areas? No, because I guess I was able to use the circumstances and resources of the time, to my advantage, and that was fine. But certainly later on, things opened up, and now, of course, we're drowning in information in many respects. Our challenge to some extent now is parsing the good from the bad, right, which didn't exist in quite the same way before. That's a major difference these days. But, academics in particular thought that they had pretty good access to resources. I think now members of the public have better access to resources than they would have had back in that day. Certainly, there's a lot more available at their fingertips about other legal systems, legal developments in other countries, and all of that. But again, there's still a need to frame this sort of material, to interpret this sort of material. That's something that we try to do on an ongoing basis. But you're right to say that the internet has opened us up, in a variety of ways. But what it's done, I think, Vidit, is more than that. It hasn't just given us direct access to more information about law elsewhere. It has given us direct connection to people elsewhere that we can talk to about all of this in pretty much real time. And that just wasn't there before as an opportunity. You could go to a conference, right? And you could meet colleagues from wherever in a conference. But, short of doing that, there was no opportunity to connect with people instantly, whether they were lawyers or legal academics or law students or whatever, and engage them in a conversation or engage them to work with you in some kind of common project. I mean, this just wasn't happening. The technology really wasn't convenient for that. And in fact, the technology really wasn't convenient for some of this until after you get past COVID in 2020. We had the technology, we didn't use it in certain ways. We had the internet, but we didn't have a lot of video connection with each other. So I think that discovery of other people has helped us a lot. Again, you have to sort of assess credibility, and you have to be careful, in terms of how you're connecting around the world. But I think we're doing something very positive now in being able to reach out to each other in ways that we couldn't before and learn from each other in real time while all of us are still in our locations, right? I mean, it was possible before, and I went through this in my time, it was possible before to have an institution like, Harvard Law School, gather together LLM students from around the world. That was great. We went there. It was fine. That was an extraordinary opportunity to learn from people while you were with them. But after that program was over, we were sort of scattered and, we didn't really connect with each other. But now, I can talk to people, law students from around the world, or you can talk to each other if you want, Tyler, at any time. And you can do it on an ongoing basis. It's continuous. It's even better than moot courts to some extent because, that setting also is sort of limited in a variety of ways. It's focused on a particular problem and a particular set of circumstances, a particular kind of gathering that you have to do the competition and that kind of thing. But, on Jurist, we can do other things. But that's also true of lawyers interacting with other lawyers, lawyers interacting with legal academics, in other parts of the world. We can all talk to each other. And I think that really opens us up to more perspectives. It allows people to talk about, their own ideas concerning their own systems. It allows them to do that while they're still in those systems and not removed. It just enables us, I think, to get a much more nuanced and personal and human sense of people's challenges in other parts of the world as those challenges relate to law.
I couldn't agree more, Professor. I mean, one of the most interesting things I've seen recently is that, normally, obviously, as law students and law professors, we're all very happy or very excited when a new Supreme Court decision comes out and we're all ready to read it. But now with the advent of social media, I'm now seeing individuals not studying law, whenever a Supreme Court decision comes out, having debates and things of that nature about whether or not they agree with decisions or not in a very sort of located to a specific location sense, and that, we can have people all over Canada or the United States talk about a particular decision and what they think. And it's done in a very sort of open conversation that anyone can be a part of. But I guess that sort of leads to another aspect of what you were talking about, which is that, with all this democratization of information, it is a question of parsing, good and reliable information from unreliable information. And I definitely sort of want to hear a little bit more about your perspectives on how we can go about doing that, because obviously we're very excited to have the chance for everyone to discuss, the law as it currently stands, but there must be ways we can sort of work towards making sure that the discussions that we're having are on the basis of good and accurate information.
Right. So I think these days, especially, we have to be much more skeptical, right? Because you don't necessarily know where information is coming from. You don't necessarily know who the speaker is. Back before the internet, you had a better sense of these things. Things went in channels, right? And those channels were vetted in many respects, whether the vetting was done by academics or publishers or lawyers or whatever. Nowadays, because the debate is general, because the conversation is general and global, there can be a lot of information out there which just isn't vetted in any way. So, what do you do? As I said, I think skepticism is important. You have to evaluate information in part based on what it is. You have to do your homework and be careful with things. You have to think about whether something is likely to be true or not. You have to verify in ways that you didn't before, if you're going to base anything on something that somebody is telling you. But I think these are things, Vidit, that law students and lawyers can do, which is one of the reasons why I love having law students work on something like JURIST, because you collectively as law students are going to spend a good part of your professional lives weighing evidence, judging credibility. That's what you need to do in order to make any kind of effective argument in court before a judge. You can't give the judge junk. I mean, you have to be able to take responsibility for the information you present. So you're making judgments all the time about what is good, what is valid, what is appropriate. And I think that even at this preliminary stage, when JURIST is sort of sending law students out into the world to look for information, to interpret events, we are giving them an opportunity to exercise that kind of judgment. We're giving them an opportunity to assess evidence, to judge credibility, to judge veracity, and then we're asking them to tell the truth as they see it in this particular context. So is it easy? No. Does one make mistakes? Inevitably. But I think if law students in particular get used to this and do not become accepting of everything they see, especially everything they see online, then they have done themselves a favor. They're going to do the legal system a favor. They're going to do their clients a favor. And certainly in the context of JURIST, they're going to do JURIST a favor because they will have thought about the information that they're presenting, before they present it. Now, of course, experience helps. Long experience helps. The longer you're involved in this kind of project, the better you get at evaluating information. But this is one of the reasons why, internally within JURIST even, there is a system of quality control. There's a system of editing and editors. It goes up various lines. And so again, nobody is in the position of having to go straight from seeing something to reporting it on JURIST. There's always another voice. There's always another perspective. There's always another check just to make sure that things are plausible and hopefully correct. Again, any institution, any media operation can make mistakes. Heaven knows that's true. But we are encouraging people to be careful. Number one, we're encouraging our law students to be careful and cautious in what they look at and what they present. And we're encouraging people to sort of test that. And we're encouraging other people, other editors, other law students to come in and sort of kick the tires on something to make sure that it is, in fact, what it seems to be. And that way we are more confident in what we produce. Again, not foolproof, but it gets all of our staff into the habit of being careful. And that is ultimately what everybody who is involved with JURIST will have to do professionally, as well as in the sort of immediate sense as members of that organization.
Yeah, of course. I mean, like, as the old saying goes, right? Like, don't have such an open mind that your brain falls out. But I mean, like the discussion about resources is really great. And like it inevitably kind of ties itself again into discussions that we've been having of the public forum itself. So outside of our previous discussion about like parsing through good and bad information and the challenges that an overabundance of information has, there's also the challenge of being too, or like not being too myopic when it comes to, especially people who want to be innovators like us, with saying, oh, well, we are pushing the boundaries of how legal information is accessed, and we fail to recognize that there's this complete other public forum that is being made in front of our eyes that we are failing to see. So, as kind of technology develops, the public forum consequently changes too. And this is something that you recognized with the advent of jurists and how you said it's evolved over time as well. Do you foresee the public forum meaningfully changing in a way that requires jurists to adapt? And in general, what do you think that public forum is likely to look like? Especially with discussions about the whole augmented reality stuff, about how the lines between real life and technology become increasingly blurred. What is your kind of perspective on that?
Yeah, inevitably, Tyler, that's right. As a developer of Jurist, and I say a developer because although I got the ball rolling, I've had a lot of help and support over the years from our staff, from our students. We've built this together. But as a developer of Jurist, inevitably I've realized, and I appreciate in retrospect, how things have changed. People consume media in different ways now than they did, 20 to 25 years ago. There are entire enterprises. Vidit just referred to social media that really didn't exist, back at that particular time. And the existence of those environments changes how you do things. It changes what you do. And you're right, Tyler, that we're going into a new kind of age again. Virtual reality, augmented reality, whatever you call it. If you buy the metaverse, what does that mean for lawyering? But all I would say is that we need to be more imaginative. At the end of the day, we are still, again, not where I thought we would be, even at this point. I thought we'd be way, way ahead of where we are, and we're still basically producing a lot of material that is, would have been perfectly recognizable in the 1980s or the 1960s, or the 1950s, or 1940s. I think we have to go to where our people are, though. We need to find the public. We're trying to serve the public here. That's something that I've always emphasized on Jurist. But the public goes to different places, and they go to different spaces, and they use those spaces in different ways. And, maybe that means that, we have to be on social media where we weren't before. Maybe that means we have to produce video where we didn't before. Maybe it means TikTok is coming. Maybe it means we have to start contemplating, larger environments in which we should operate. Lawyers are just very slow in getting into these environments. But we need to contemplate those things, and we need to encourage experimentation. And we also need to appreciate, some of the dangers that we're going to face along the way. But experimentation is key. I mean, that's what we started to do back in the late 1990s. Frankly, I've been experimenting or trying to experiment on Jurist in various ways and in various media for over 2 decades now. I think we're coming to a time when somebody else should do most of the experimenting, and we need younger people to come in and look at what this could be and where this is going to go. In Jurist's history, we have had various people who have come onto our staff and who have had an impact on the way we think about things. And in the context of this question, Tyler, I think about one of them right now, who came on to staff as a student back in I guess it was early 2000s, and then ultimately was a member of the professional staff for some time before he went on to other things. And to this day, he's still involved in innovation. He's actually involved in robotics at the moment, but a very forward-looking thinker. And when we always he and I talk about Jurist, he always comes up with a question, and that question is this: if Jurist were invented today, what would it be? if it were invented today, what would it be? So forget the legacy, forget the way we've been doing things for however long. What would it be if it were invented now? Because if it were invented now, it would be invented with a view to what is happening now, what the trajectory of change is, with a view to getting out in front of that change, just as we try to get out in front of that change in the late 1990s, right? So you don't design for the late 1990s. You design for the 2000s, 2010s, and beyond that. Now, if we did that, if we invented JURIST now, what would it look like? It would be designed in part for the 2030s, the 2040s. I mean, we've been trying to get into these new areas. I think that's where we should go. I think that's what we should do. I may not get there with you, as they say, in that particular context, but I think that's what we need to do to be fresh and to make sure that what we are doing has value for the public who is going to populate those spaces, and for our students who are going to have to work in those spaces eventually. So again, instead of preparing our students to fight the battles of the 1990s or perhaps the 1890s in a variety of ways, because that's when law reviews started, maybe we should be trying to equip them to get into these other areas. And maybe in projects like JURIST, we can ping the future a little bit just to see where we might be going and to test certain things and certain ways of communicating that we might need to get into. And like I said, this is not for me at this particular point, but I think it would be for others. And if we are going to realize our goal of serving the public and helping them with their understanding and appreciation of the rule of law in crisis, I think we should be doing those kinds of things, and we should be preparing for that kind of trajectory now, in the hopes that we will actually get there and perhaps be with the public when they go in these directions. Otherwise, we're just going to fall further and further back. We're going to become more and more disconnected. And I don't think that's going to be good for anybody, whether it's jurists or the legal profession or legal academics or law schools or whatever you want. So again, we have to look forward. We have to be imagined.
Absolutely. Okay. I mean, so I think your point about designing for the future is a great perspective to have. And I actually haven't really thought about it that way before. And I think this actually ties into our previous discussion as well about how the public forum develops and changes in its form, as well as where people choose to go to. But as a follow-up, and to not necessarily push back on you, Professor, but I think a unique challenge of the future as well is that the public forum is almost, for lack of a better word, becoming increasingly less material, right? It's becoming significantly more, it's like, I can't explain, I can't find the exact wording for it, but yeah, it's less material, it's less substantive than, for example, a traditional public forum would. And I think this is showcased by the demise of Twitter and its degeneration into X. So, I think that the trend of a lot of these types of public forums seems to be the case that there's a larger risk of, these forums degenerating or dissolving or changing so drastically and so dynamically that it's almost not impossible, but extremely difficult to look for the future in the same way that it would be if you were taking it from the perspective the early 2000s, looking what 2010s and 2020s would be like. So how do you think we navigate those kinds of challenges, given the highly and increasingly kind of unstable and unpredictable nature of how the public forum is changing?
I think in communication, in publication, in even in law, there is no guarantee of permanence at all, right? The very institutions that we are a part of, Tyler and Vidit. I mean, I hate to say this, but I speak as an historian. University of Ottawa law faculty is relatively new. Last 100 years, basically. University of Toronto law faculty, only perhaps a little bit older. The idea of law schools, as we know them now, didn't really exist as a major feature of American legal training prior to, the 1830s or 1840s, and really didn't come into their own till later. Things are constantly changing. Institutions don't have guaranteed existences. Their sell-by dates are not obvious. Maybe some of the institutions that we're talking about are past their sell-by dates already. We don't know that, but maybe they are. Law reviews are not permanent. JURIST is not going to be permanent. Is that a bad thing? In a very limited institutional sense, maybe, but maybe not otherwise. Maybe we need to have some dynamism. Maybe we need to have the freedom to do certain things for a while and then move on to other things. Maybe the frames do need to be changed on occasion so that you can lift yourself out of the previous, sort of arrangements, whatever they are, and do things in a fundamentally better way. The future has to secede from the past in some respects. In order for it to be the future, in order for it to be better, in order for it to realize its own ambitions. So, if I don't want things to degenerate, I don't want jurists to become X or something like this, perish the thought. But at the same time, it serves a purpose in its moment. And if we find collectively that there is something else which serves that purpose better, then I think we should give way to that in some fashion. Maybe our experience can contribute to improvement in the future. Maybe there will be things which will be better in a variety of ways. Maybe there will be tools that will be better. But I think the purposes that jurist serves, will continue in some way. Jurist itself may continue in some way for some time. I mean, you don't know what the growth pattern is going to be. You don't know what the trajectory is going to be. There are no certainties. But I certainly would say that dynamism is to be expected. I certainly would say that all forms of education and communication have limited lifespans. Historians know that. And we have to hope that the forms which follow us in some way are as effective as the ones which preceded us. We don't want to move into degeneration, but we do want to respond. And if that response means that we change our forms, then so be it, so long as the purposes that we serve, whether the purposes are education, whether the purposes are propagation and support of the rule of law, whether the purposes are something else, are served. Those are the most important things. The purposes are what matter. The institutions and the vehicles are secondary. The purposes are what matter. And so that's the point that I would just sort of emphasize in this particular context. I think that's what we have to keep our eyes on.
And Professor, I mean, this is just sort of a follow-up from that discussion. But I mean, one of the big concerns that I think exists now is so much of communication is rooted in form and the form in which this delivery does happen. One of the sort of key ideals that I think is really admirable about jurists is that jurists sort of made the bold statement that for us to get, accurate, very reliable legal information, it need not come from a 30 or 40 page long article published in a particular book, but instead could be a much shorter article published online available to everyone. I think now in our society, when so much of the content that individuals in the public consume comes from sort of short form posts on social media or short form video, is there a way we can still sort of present the nuances that so many of the legal issues that we discuss have in a way that's responsible, but also in a way that's accessible and not reductive in sort of the shorter format that exists nowadays?
Yeah, we're fighting that battle continuously, Vidit, and I appreciate the question. When Jurist started, when we got into legal news in a major way, after we brought on law students in the early 2000s for the first time as a sort of large-scale enterprise, we started to very consciously produce our stories in kind of a two-paragraph format. And we've moved on from that somewhat since. We are not quite as reductionist, but we were making a point at the time that we wanted things to be kind of short and sweet. We understood that people on the web were going to be busy, that they were going to scan information differently, that we couldn't just write a standard news article in the same way that the New York Times did or something like that. And we also knew at the same time that part of Jurist's message and part of the information that Jurist was conveying in this two-paragraph format was under the hood, because we were including links in our stories. And this was at a time when the New York Times wasn't including links in their stories. Major media weren't doing that at all. So the Jurist story was, two paragraphs on its surface, but then it had this depth, and you would drill down, you could get further information. So it actually turned out to be more substantive at the end of the day. But we just presented the first part of this, as a digestible portion that you could sort of get quickly and then move on, or you could dig down, you could do what you want. Now, of course, we've gone to the other extreme, not we on Jurist, but I mean, we've gone to the other extreme since, right, with 140 characters or whatever, very, very telegraphed forms of information. Of course, Jurist does that, right? We do that too in some of our social media services. But, we try to make sure that across our services, we are communicating depth. And we're trying to make sure that even if we're communicating a particular message in a very short way because it's on social media, or if we're writing a story about something which is still pretty compact, right, by print standards, that we will come back to the idea, that we will come back to the issue over and over again, and we'll be able ultimately to offer something that's cumulative and offer something that's more nuanced. Because unlike the 30 to 40 page law review article, and also unlike the tweet, we will come back to the same things again and again because we have an agenda, we have an editorial policy, we have a strategy. And so if you are absorbing jurists' information, if you are taking jurists' news, if you are reading what our students are working so hard to produce and write, you will come away with this larger, more nuanced idea of what is going on, even though the individual portions, again, Vidit, are bite-sized, right? They're easy to take in, but we're still giving you something that over time, to press the metaphor, that over time will be good for you. That over time, will make a difference and will allow you to get a more nuanced appreciation of what is actually going on in the world. And of course, if that means ultimately we have to do more multimedia stuff, we'll do more multimedia stuff. If we ever get to the point of doing other kinds of stuff in the proverbial multiverse, I hope we will do that. But we're going to try to draw readers in, or draw viewers in, or whatever the term is going to be. So that at the end of the day, whatever the medium, they get a better, more accurate sense of what is actually going on, and learn about the world and learn about themselves in a way that hopefully will encourage them to go on and do good things.
Amazing. Unfortunately, it does seem like we're reaching towards the ends of our time. But obviously, before I do the conclusion, everything like that, I don't want to leave any stone unturned. Professor, do you think there's anything important that we might not have discussed in the conversation today? Are there any things that we should be investigating more into the future? Are there issues or pieces of your work that you think we could have talked more about? I'd love to know your perspective on that.
I could take this in various directions, I suppose, Tyler, but here's what I want to say in the present context. What's important here, at least as far as I'm concerned, when we're talking about jurist, is the importance and significance of the enterprise for the law students who staff it and power it. I want to give them a lever where they can move the world. And that's important because, number one, the world is on fire at the moment. We face enormous challenges. Law students have tremendous potential, right? I'm a law professor. I mean, that is my original calling. It is my original purpose. That is, the primary reason why I built Jurist in the first place. And I put law students forward on Jurist because I wanted them to learn. I wanted them to learn about the world. I wanted them to do something. And I wanted them to have a tool that would allow them to do something in a way which I thought and hoped would transcend the levers that they traditionally had available to themselves. And I also wanted them to understand that they had power and capacity as a group, right? And that's something that law students really don't understand that much. We're perhaps moving in this direction. There are signs currently that law students may be appreciating their potential a little bit more. Some of that may be facilitated by some of the connections that are developed through social media and other kinds of instrumentalities these days. But Jurist is one of those environments, right, where you have all these law students, very ambitious, very bright, very good communicators, coming together around the world for the purpose of improving it through communication and education. And as they do that, they will feel more confident, I hope, in themselves. They will know more about the environment that they are going into after graduation. They will know more about their counterparts around the world, and they'll see the similarities and the connections that they have to those people. And I'm hoping that, by means of all of that, they will be more willing to go beyond simply reporting what's happening and will move towards actually changing things, to improving things, to actually leveraging their own abilities. to make a difference in the lives of their communities, in the trajectories of their societies. This is a large-scale proposition, obviously, but jurist is a large-scale proposition to begin with. I think that there's tremendous potential here in the medium that we're using, because, of course, it's electronic, it suits the times, it's all of this. But I think our biggest potential is who we are, what jurist is, and the people who make it possible and power it every day. Because that particular instrument, Tyler, unlike the other ones that we have traditionally created in law schools, is not aimed inside. It is not aimed at other law schools, other law professors. It's aimed at the world every day. And yes, we can draw law professors into this exercise in a variety of ways. We can do those kinds of things. But I think once law students get used to the fact that they can broadcast to the world, that they can reach out, they can touch people, they can impact their lives, they can help them, they can inform them. Once they get used to that idea, then maybe they can continue to do that when they get out into the wider world. And maybe they realize that when they do that, they will have allies, they will have compatriots, they will have colleagues everywhere around the world who are in one way or another interested in doing the same thing. And if that connection is made, then law students can do a tremendous amount. Maybe jurists can just be the beginning or a beginning for a larger initiative, which really would change the world for the better.
Wow. I mean, it's very difficult to follow up on that. I mean, that is an extremely admirable calling and purpose that you've given, not just to yourself, but for us as law students as well, with oftentimes, lacking like a sense of direction in many cases, entering and being thrust into a world that is so complex. Our goal, albeit with smaller capacity than jurist, is very similar on the Beyond Today podcast, where we hope to empower, law students with easily accessible information to get direction in their careers, to understand complex topics that we've talked about today, to think critically about their own connection with the law as well. So, I mean, thank you so much, Professor, for taking the time out of your day. I mean, this conversation has far exceeded my already high expectations for what I was prepared to learn. I'm sure I speak for Vidit as well when I say that. And I hope this is especially illuminating for everyone watching at home as well, and that this was an enjoyable experience for you as well, Professor. So, I mean, as like the final closing remarks, if you'd just like to provide information to the listeners where we can find more about you, and as well as your work, as well as that of Jurist, now is the time to do so.
Okay, well, that's great, Tyler, and thank you very much, and thank you, Vidit, for the invitation to come and speak here. This has been a wonderful conversation. I've really enjoyed it tremendously. And sometimes you only really get a chance to talk about these things in environments like this, which are more open, and so I really do appreciate what you've done here. To learn more about me, I guess you can find me in various places and spaces online. I'm a law professor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, so you can certainly find me on that website. You can find me on LinkedIn. That's a great way to connect if you're interested in doing that. And of course on Jurist. I'm certainly accessible through there in a variety of different ways. I see a lot of traffic that comes in from Jurist every day, obviously, but you can find Jurist at jurist.org or www.jurist.org if you want to put that into your web browser. And obviously, I'm happy to talk to anybody who's interested in coming on to Jurist and joining a staff. If you're a law student, that's great. If you're not a law student, obviously still interested in your reactions to what we produce on the site. I'm just again thankful to you, Tyler, for giving me another opportunity to talk about the exciting things that we have going on there, and for giving me an opportunity in particular to talk about the wonderful people who make it possible, who cannot be here today. I simply represent them, but they make a huge difference, and it's a privilege to work with all of them, and of course, in this particular context, Tyler, with you as well.
Absolutely. And, Jurist has made a huge impact on me, and I appreciate the opportunity I still remember when I received the offer. So, it's a little bit of a full circle moment. But amazing. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you, Vidit, for co-hosting with me as well. Great discussion. And hopefully we can do this again sometime in the future.
I'd like that. Thanks very much, Tyler. Thank you, Vidit.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.